Welcome to Practical Shamanism. I'm Katie Weatherup. I'm a former engineer with 20 years of experience working as a shamanic practitioner, and I hope to help you to connect to your personal power and magic, and to support you in living a really good life that just keeps getting better. Thank you so much for joining me. I was reading this beautiful piece of writing about taking a pause and breaking habitual patterns and finding a really up-to-date response when we're reckoning with deep, intense, hard things. And the whole thing was really beautiful, but there was a line that kind of articulated something I thought really beautifully, which had to do with navigating social media criticism. And the writer was saying that her approach and belief about things was you don't have to take criticism from people that you wouldn't take advice from. And I really appreciated the succinctness and the clarity of that, because we live in a world with a whole lot of people who have the narrative that they have the right and that it's even important or good to tell other people how they should be in the world. And I feel like we come by this honestly at a kind of a biological brain development level. And then we live in a culture that really exacerbates it. And I think there's probably some reward chemistry, some fear chemistry, some things that get mixed up in it. And there are a lot of people who just have really poor boundaries about pausing and deciding if their input or their feedback or their reflection is given consensually. And often when I post something to Facebook, I remind the circle of people who are connected to me on there, who are choosing. They could unfollow, they could unfriend, I really don't monitor who my Facebook friends are. But if they're going to participate with me in that space, then I'm really clear when I'm just wanting to share something about my journey, wanting to express something, and when feedback or reflection or advice is welcome. And I often include in the post, to help people make choices that will be more successful with me, what I am or am not looking for. And for those people who just can't behave, I have different responses. If I really like them and feel connected to them in other ways, I might make an effort to have a conversation about what works for me. And if they're just somebody who I've never really met in person, I don't even know, I'll put them onto what's called I think it's the restricted list, where they can only see my public posts. And I have a lot of what I share about my life set to a friend setting, and it doesn't mean that we have to be friends in real life. I'm super happy to have, people that I've never met participate, but there is kind of this basic standard. So the elaborateness of which I've just described kind of speaks to how much we deal with unsolicited advice from unqualified people. And I think having a principle of that can help us come to center. So it doesn't mean that it doesn't feel good or hurt or our heads don't get loud if somebody tells us of their negative story about us. They've made up some kind of, you're an awful person and here's my evidence for why. And no matter how wildly unqualified and emotionally unregulated and how little respect you have for that person, or even if you don't know them, there's still a lot of biological hardwiring that has reactivity. We can end up arguing in our head with people that don't even matter in our lives. And so we all have these different ways that we deal with that. But I feel like having a thought about what your qualifications are for feedback and criticism, and who you allow to tell you something about who you are and who you allow to tell something about your behavior, is a really important thing to have a structure about. Not everybody needs this. There are certainly people out there with much thicker skin who are just like, and they'll just move on with their lives. And for them, what I'm saying here is probably not that relevant. But for those of us who are sensitive and who value really aligned relating, I prize, ease and alignment, and people who take responsibility for their shadow work and work to clean up their triggers. There's a kind of a list of what is needed to be successful in any level of relating. Like there's a simple standard for a Facebook friend. There are standards that I have for clients of what I need from them. For example, not being a psychologist, the transference thing that can come up in therapy is just not something I'm down with. I don't want to represent someone's, mother wounds in the kind of shamanic healing work that I'm doing. So if they're having a lot of really old trigger or bouncing their authority figure stuff off of me, and in fairness, I went around and did that to people while I was working it out. I'd put them on a pedestal, make them an authority figure, and then in my head argue with them. I think, though, I had the good taste not to go attempt to force them to be involved in my, internal ambivalence about, wanting someone to tell me how to do it and then wanting to prove that they were wrong and unqualified. It was an awkward developmental growth stage along my healing journey when I was trying to figure things out. So I think it can kind of help have some detachment if we sort of look at why do people feel compelled to keep behaving in this really obnoxious way of giving unsolicited, unwanted feedback to other people and trying to control their behavior? And there's a lot of it that goes around. And I think that if we really look at what helped hunter-gatherer humans and agricultural early humans survive, having the community agree on how to behave was pretty important. So if someone was being careless with fire near the barn, that could put a whole bunch of people's survival at risk. And so you would have opinions about how they dealt with fire, or how they dealt with cleanliness, or how they dealt with social agreements, because when you were living in these tribal communities that were so necessary for survival, or the interwoven of having, adjacent farms, how people participated in the social contracts was really impactful. And we have these brains that haven't really caught up to how much sorting we can do, how much we can close the door and walk away from people. And sure, it's more complicated. I work with clients who, due to, some of what they're dealing with on a health level or a psychological level, are living with their parents because there's struggle. That's the most appropriate solution that's available, but it comes with a price tag of being around people who aren't necessarily interfacing with them in the way they would prefer. So sometimes we end up with situations where it's not as easy, but often even then there's a solo bedroom where the door can be closed. And so we have so much more freedom to just walk away. And yet it's really, really hard for us to, see somebody behaving in a way that's not okay and just walk away. There's that meme on Facebook about honey, I can't come to bed yet. Somebody's being wrong on Facebook. And, it's funny, but if we don't supervise our brains, they'll kind of get all that charge and jump into it. And I think that for a lot of people, that's an emotional numbing strategy, that kind of outrage and indignation and telling people they're wrong and being the one who's right is a way to mask vulnerability and loneliness and sadness. They're emotions we reckon with that don't feel really good. And I think people can be very adept at shifting into something that has a little bit more rev in the chemistry. Righteous indignation for a very short window can feel really good in the body, but it suppresses the immune system and does all kinds of crazy stuff. So it's not a particularly viable long-term strategy. But before people reach for drugs or alcohol, often they have their own series of thoughts that are, accessing the factory of hormones in the brain. We're wildly good at that. So it can feel like something that's necessary and important to safety. And I just came across a group that I'm really finding quite delightful. It's called the Burned Haystack Method of Online Dating. And the organizer has, she's a humor writer, so she's funny and she has a really succinct way of encapsulating knowledge. She's doing a lot of the things that I've learned about that, and I just love that this community is there. And one of her guidelines and things that she talks about a lot is don't go educating men who are participating with you in an online dating space in what they're doing wrong. It's not the place for it. And once in a while I fall into that, and it works about as well as you would think. The most of the time they are indignant and defensive, and occasionally they're like, ooh, free emotional labor, how can I be more successful? But as she pointed out, like even if you give really good counsel and someone takes it in, it's not like they've done deep work to participate differently. It's more that they might add on a couple of surface level skills to eclipse something about their fundamental approach to online dating. And I don't mean to pick on men here. I think there are, plenty of women who are also, that men in online dating would benefit from the burned haystack method of just really efficiently closing the door on things that aren't going to go anywhere and focusing your energy on what is available that could be successful, and also just not having it take so much overhead that you get sick of it and delete all your apps. And I know this is kind of a case off to the side for people who are in a particular space, but that sort of universal nature to have opinions about how people should be in the world. And I started thinking like, wow, with all the social media and everything and the divisive politics, we've gotten worse about that. And the guides popped into my mind a documentary I was seeing where they were citing a letter or a writing that someone had about the Puritans, and the woman describing looking in someone's window and seeing her having sex with somebody who wasn't her husband and beating on the window and being like, you stop doing that, you're going to go to hell, this is not okay, you're in a marriage, and the Puritan way that basically made it incumbent on the community to enforce all of these really strict religious rules. And we can see a lot of places that kind of plays out through the world where it's codified into law. And the narrative, presumably, I don't know a lot about it, is that they're doing a good thing by enforcing these ideologies and these kind of standards. So I feel like kind of recognizing that someone who's doing this non-consensually and in a way that's disruptive to relationships probably has their instincts running the show. They're not being particularly thoughtful. They're not calibrating the results. They're not necessarily on a personal growth path that's working out. I know it's a huge generalization. I mean, there certainly we can go through our awkward growing stages, but when someone's in that place, you probably have the fight or flight instinct response running the show. And I would offer that with that person, there just isn't a lot of richness of what you may be interested in terms of relating. There isn't a lot of ability to be heard in what you say. Confirmation bias is scary. People can hear something so different from what was said clearly. And communication, obviously, I'm super geeky about it, really, really important. And so when someone's brain is going to lie to them about what you said, that might not be a place to engage in communication. And it's just kind of a discernment and a sorting. So coming back around to feedback and advice, one of the pieces of wisdom that gets passed around in memes is, a wise man can learn from a fool, but a fool cannot learn from a wise man, which, is a good argument for not, attempting to share your wisdom with, somebody who is absolutely not going to receive it. It's better to have receptivity and have people who are seeking it and save it for sharing in those places. But I also think that when those sayings were written, we did not have so frigging many people in the world. There were smaller populations. And so harvesting what you could gain from this individual or that individual, and the wisdom might be if you see them coming down the street, go the other way because it's not going to go well. It didn't mean wisdom is like, oh, I will sit and witness them in an unlimited way. But I feel like where we put our attention, there can be so much richer places that we can harvest wisdom. And so as someone who's on the introvert side, who enjoys depth, who enjoys being received, in a way that's somewhat congruent with who I actually am, I'm constantly sorting really, really, really thoroughly. So this unsolicited feedback, I think if you're someone who is criticized no matter how invalid the source, and that's an ouch for you, having compassion for yourself that that's true, and having ways to restore yourself as efficiently as possible is really useful. And I'm not going to go into the many ways that we can restore ourselves. Sometimes it's venting, sometimes it's hearing from someone who is in our fan club. There are many, many ways that we can bring ourselves back to center, but acknowledging that our instincts that we all have hardwired into us took it as a threat and wanted to get all wound up in this experience of criticism. We come by that honestly. It's biologically deep inside of ourselves, and we can provide our instincts with adult supervision and bring ourselves back to center. So no self-criticism that this happens, and the duration in which we can come back to center is really important. Now, like I said, there are people who just don't feel this way. There's one person I follow named Alison Armstrong who describes this in a strongly gendered way. I don't know that this is completely true, because I think there are women who don't have high sensitivity and men who really are very, very sensitive to criticism. And so it isn't necessarily, but in this kind of broader sense, for what she describes for the people who aren't responding to criticism, is they have these layers of protection. They can effectively consider the source and toss it out if they don't respect the opinion of the source. It's like a natural process. And for some of us, we kind of have to add on the consider the source wisdom. And they also, run it through, does this feel true? And even if it feels true, it may not be worth changing. Like, I just wouldn't get anything out of making that different. It's too much work, And so there are all these, worth it equations and everything else that some people have related to this. And for those of us who that isn't as much a natural part, where we're like, whatever, and on with life I go, it's worth kind of onboarding a psychological map that allows us to be really clear with where we stand, and then calm and soothe the emotions that are shrieking that it ought to go a different way. So going back to that burned haystack method of online dating, you could have the urge come up to just give this really succinct feedback to this person who obviously has earnest intentions, but they're missing the mark, and you're not going to rectify a lack of social skills with a few lines. And the point of the facilitator is, hey, if you're going to do charity work, go do charity work. If you're going to gift your time and talent, do that by all means. But this is not the place. This is not what people are looking for. And if someone is missing the mark on connection, social skills are a learnable skill. Like, there are a ton of blogs that are just willing to really break down step by step ways that will have general successful interface with other people. My sister went out with me one time, and she was, very, very socially successful, and we were sitting around and men were coming up to us, and she just was totally closed in all of her charisma, avoided eye contact to make sure that I was the more interesting person. And then she coached me. She's like, well, this guy asked you a question and you answered it, and then it's your turn to ask a question. That keeps the conversation going. I was painfully shy at the time, and she's just, it was a real act of generosity on her part. She's just neat lady. My sister's neat human being. But that was obviously something that, she felt called to help me with, and I wanted to receive, and, and so it went. So when we have these parts of us that, get really spun, that's valid. But I think having that touchstone of nope, it's not a good idea to give unsolicited feedback. Nope, this person isn't qualified. I know you're having a big reaction, but we can facilitate that coming back to center, because so much energy leak happens when we end up ruminating on things. And so when it comes to feedback or criticism, for me, there's a question of whether I consider the relationship expendable. And I know that's kind of an intense word, but for me, if something is going to have struggle and the payoff on whatever level, this could be the payoff of someone paying me money, or it could be the payoff of the emotional things I get out of, if what it's going to cost me to deal with a mismatch and what I'm going to get out of it is less, it's just never going to have sustainability. I'm going to end up backfilling it constantly with my own energy. And I might choose to do that. I might be, my niece and nephew are young, but they will someday be teenagers. And I might choose to participate with them, even if they were working my last nerve, because their brains are developing, and there's teenage delusions of grandeur that can be unpalatable to adults. So there might be reasons that we consciously make the choice. I was involved for years in a medieval recreation group, the Society for Creative Anachronism, weird name, but SCA. And one of the things that was really beautiful about it was how inclusive it was to socially awkward people. And there were just a lot of people who were willing to be present with you no matter how weird and awkward and unawarely obnoxious, you might have been. And that was a probably reasonable description of, 19, 20-year-old Katie. And it was a really special part of my life, and there was a lot of generosity. And for better or for worse, that's just not the generosity that I'm interested in sharing with the world. I'm generous in other ways, but I'm not interested in being generous with unpaid emotional labor or time and attention. And so if I have a friendship, and someone's projecting a lot onto me, I had a gal years ago, and she just so much taking offense where none was intended, and absolutely not willing to go to therapy. And many people recommended it, but she would come back and say, well, you made this comment like 3 months ago, and what did you mean by it? And I'm like, I don't even remember the comment. Well, it sounded like you said blah, blah, blah. Well, that really doesn't sound like something I would say or mean. So yeah, that wasn't my intention. And on the one hand, I wanted her, if she was feeling wounded, to be able to check something out with me, because, communication is good. But on the other hand, you start stacking up these, I'm interacting with open-heartedness and happy to see her and feeling good and looking at her with positive regard. And, and then you just never know when there's going to be this processing conversation about something that happened a while ago. And it really was a take on the relationship. And again, like I said, she just absolutely wasn't willing to sit down with a therapist who could have held really good space for her to kind of self-facilitate herself out of these really big triggers that then she, obviously would ruminate on for really long periods of time, even in her relationships where she had every reason to be the most trusting. And, over time it developed into these delusions where her monogamous, faithful partners, she totally 100% believed were cheating on her, and, all this, just really, really tough stuff. So one of the boundary distinctions I think is important. So for people, if I'm going to process something with them, if I'm going to have a processing conversation, it means that I care enough about the relationship that I'm trying to get us into a place of more successful relating. That's the goal that I'm having, that whatever has happened between us is putting us on a track where we part ways, and I genuinely don't want that. So that's one of my, kind of choices for whether I just take care of myself in boundary, that like the Facebook people, if I want to keep them in my circle. I might make an effort to discuss what works for me and what doesn't as far as how they comment on my posts. And if I really don't, I just pop them on the restricted list. I feel like unfriending can be harsh. And so I just make this other move that they don't necessarily ever know about. And it's efficient. So I have the distinction of processing being reserved for people who matter in my life, and boundarying being, very much a take it or leave it. And a good example of one of my boundaries is with my healing practice, you really need to be able to use the website. And there are lots of reasons people couldn't use the website. They might be neurodivergent. They might be in an older demographic. There are plenty of places. And for me, I sometimes get, how do I download and listen to the MP3? And I'm like, I can't coach you in that. I don't have that background. You can get somebody to sit with you and help show you that, but that's not something I can provide. And if someone just can't use the booking system, I'm just not willing, for how much it costs me and what else I could get up to in the world, to be on the phone with them, writing things down, manually helping them, taking their credit card over the phone. And I don't add on the cost of that overhead. So my sessions are more affordable for people who can work it out. I'm doing the thing that I like the best. And again, if I had a personal connection to somebody, I might make a different choice where the sustaining and what I was contributing to the relationship, that made sense. But in general, I'm peaceful with if you can't use my system, we're just not a good fit. And I'm really sorry about that. My mother would really, really struggle if she had to, use my booking software, even as simple as it is. She's just not really a computer person. And with my mother, I'm completely willing to do all of her online stuff. She calls me up, I order her things on Amazon. It's way easier to do for than teach. And my mother is a really awesome person who I love a lot, who contributes in my life now and in the past in so many ways. And I feel great about that choice. So I think that's really useful. I think the more that we aren't giving unsolicited feedback, the easier it is to bounce unsolicited feedback. And then for the people I care about and am in relationship with, the feedback of, I'm having a response to this. This didn't work for me. I didn't like it. I'm struggling with it. This is painful, is something that I think is legitimate. I think it's good to know how our actions impact other people. I think when that's a really big blind spot and we're super oblivious to the effect we're having. One of the things I love is my neighbors have dogs and it's a shared yard. So they come to my little sliding glass door and I get to go out and play with dogs. And they got a boxer puppy and the other two are Chihuahuas. And the Chihuahuas are often super annoyed with the boxer because she's huge and she plays way too rough and she wants to be the dominant one. And there's nothing mean about this dog. She's just completely oblivious to how unpleasant it can be to be a Chihuahua with a boxer with really, really limited social skills awareness and an absolute abundance of energy. And what she thinks is fun feels like, being hunted and unsafe. One of the Chihuahuas got really good at bolting for the railing on the porch because she could slide through on either side. So whichever way the boxer went, she could, get herself to safety and personal space when she needed it. And as the boxer got older, she's calmed down, but I still hear commentary from the Chihuahuas about not enjoying her. So feedback in the form of, ouch, that hurt, or wow, that didn't work for me, I think for someone I'm committed to relating to can be powerful. And the outcome might be like, oh wow, we have such a difference. I'm so sorry. We can't go forward. That's not going to work out. I'm not flexible in this area. Or there can be something where it's like, oh gosh, yeah, I'm happy to pivot on that. That'll work. We can get into ease and sustainability. Thanks for letting me know. But that impact of actions, I think, is really important. But I think it crosses a line when someone is giving feedback that tells you what's wrong with you or who you should be in the world. One person I occasionally follow, it's funny because it's 2/3 of this I really love how you articulate it and 1/3 really annoys me, and it's just an interesting stimulation to see how he's thinking about putting the world together. And obviously I don't agree with all of it, but he did a whole article defining gaslighting as the whole telling someone that their way of being in the world is invalid when they had an investment that if you were different, my life would go better. So, for example, somebody shows up late, and I feel like the stories of like, if you respected me, you would be on time are absolutely ridiculous. Those are two different things. And what it costs someone to be on time, if somebody has ADHD, it's going to cost them a hell of a lot more to figure out a system to consistently be on time. And they may just need friends who recognize that and are like, we'll just get started. We'll go ahead and order. You'll be here when you're there. So certainly on timeness can be a thing that gets worked out. But the person who, says, wow, it was really aggravating to sit alone in a restaurant and wait for you for 20 minutes. I didn't like that. I think that's really valid feedback. The whole like, you're not organized enough. And if you were, respectful and you could blah, 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 and I do this and blah, like, I would say that is inappropriate. And unfortunately, a lot of people, just don't make that distinction. And so that might be a place to put boundaries or to just be aware of. And going back to the who gets to tell you something about how effective your way of being in the world is, I have a pretty short list of people that I would accept that from, because there's so much complexity to what I'm up to. There's so many values I'm in service to with any choice. There's so many different parts of me that I'm reckoning with. And I do have someone that I go to regularly with those questions because it's really useful. And I have inner circle friends who are absolutely invited to, hold up a mirror if they feel like there's a blind spot that, maybe when I'm complaining about the thing, I may not have considered this other option. And they have a style of doing it that is really aligned for me. And honestly, they don't do a lot. And they're people that I would go to for counsel. They're people that I would say, I'm trying to solve this problem and I don't have an answer. And that's wonderful. And there are questions that I would crowdsource, like, hey, what do people know about a good electrician in this area? But I think going back to the asking for advice, there are a lot of people who I just feel like their emotional and psychological health and functionality and how things are working out and how they're being in the world doesn't have a lot of what I would want. I started to say this is less than mine. I realized that was kind of judgy, and I think better discerning language is their results that they're consistently producing in life are very, very far from what I desire for myself. And those just wouldn't be people I would go to for advice. It doesn't mean that people don't go through difficult things, but, they're people who navigate troubled waters of life, of illnesses and losses, and have really elegant wisdom to share of what they know about that territory. And, people who are finding success in different ways. And I don't think you have to be spectacularly successful at something in order to have a lot of really great wisdom to share. You can still be, in the middle of the journey and say like, hey, I'm in this journey like you are, and here's what I've learned so far, and here's where I think, we're going if invited, so it's not to say, I only seek out people who have things put to bed, and sometimes they're not the best coaches. Like I had a vocal coach back when I was singing in a Celtic folk band, and with a lot of hard work I achieved solid mediocrity. And so I was taking voice lessons because I am not a good singer. I don't have a good ear. Everybody in the band had a better musical ear than I did. And the person that I was working with was a naturally talented singer, because, if you're a naturally talented singer and you absolutely love singing, why wouldn't you teach voice lessons? But the whole, you just do this thing wasn't particularly helpful coaching. Like, what's so obvious that you're, off by a quarter note isn't obvious to someone who doesn't have that ear trained. And so somebody who's, found a path forward after wrestling with your difficulty might be a lot more useful than the, brilliant, naturally talented singer, for example. The other thing that I think is super important about feedback and ways that we're being mirrored to ourselves is it's so much better when people aren't triggered. So there was this whole kind of elaborate way of giving feedback for a successful community. And one of the rules was you only give reflections and feedback when it's invited and when you're not triggered with the person, when the feedback is intended to be coming from as a gift. So if you have trigger with it and you have charge, you might have some really succinct things to say about like, yes, this does annoy me, and yes, I feel like you should do it differently, but you don't give that. And I think it's a really good rule and expectation and boundary for yourself. Brene Brown has the don't type, don't talk, don't text when she's triggered. So I think it's a good, wow, I have trigger, this isn't a great time to have an intricate processing conversation. There may be communication like I need some space, or I'm feeling really angry at you right now. But when we let our sort of more sophisticated communication centers, it's really good to brood on an insult and have our brain construct the most intricate, elaborate, reasonable seeming story of how the other person's way of being in the world is invalid and how they're bad and wrong when we didn't get the thing we wanted from them. And then we blurt that out. And there is a lot of damage that happens to the relationship, usually on either side of it, a lot of trust that's broken. And it doesn't mean that there isn't something where you need to cough up the truth, like this isn't working for me. And if you do it in a calm moment, you can allow space for the other person to have their trigger and their reaction and the take apart, and then the co-creative rebuilding of connection around something more sustainable. So this isn't to say there aren't processing conversations, but it's really good to not do it while you're triggered and to take the time and the space to recognize where your old history may be coming up, where your relationship with your mother or your ex-husband or whoever it is might be coloring your level of reactivity. And it doesn't mean there isn't something that needs to be adjusted or new agreements made or new understandings or a more elegant approach. Like, relationships are complicated, but it is important that if you do it in a charged place, you may leave the heart connection behind in the urgency to express. And if you need to express, by all means, find somebody who can hold safe space while you vent. If you don't have that, you can even speak into a recorder and delete it later, speak it out loud, journal it. You don't want to block your expression. It's just nearly impossible when somebody's flinging really triggered communication at another person for them to stay open-hearted and hear the pain underneath and have compassion. Like, humans are not wired that way, and that is a lot of sophisticated add-on, kind of stuff when it's adult to adult. I think, a lot of parents, have more success when their 2-year-old is screaming, "I hate you," of being able to hold the, "I love this little being," and wow, we're having, a difficult moment of relating that they, are filled to the brim with indignation about not getting the cookie that they wanted on the timeline they wanted it. So I think it's a really useful thing to kind of notice, oh, this person sounds like they were triggered with me when they gave this feedback. Invalid, don't need to take it in, don't need to reckon with it. If I want to check this out, you could go to somebody who is on that list of people you would ask for advice, people whose approach to the journey and their life results and where they're going is somebody that you respect, that you're like, yeah, that their values are aligned, what they care about. Like, I'm super specific about what I care about in kind of this weird, obscure, geeky way. And so the people listening to my podcast are probably going to be people who have a lot of complexity and dynamic nature and emotionality and spirituality and, are geeky about successful relating, not just let's stuff everything under the rug and get drunk and just not make such a big deal of it. Like, that strategy may not be the one that is preferred by the people who would really resonate with what I have to say. And so if you do have somebody, howling at you, you can go through a trusted source and, solicit their thoughts on, what's been flung at you. But I think that kind of working to onboard all right, I'm having a big emotional reaction and my head's getting loud, and that is something that I absolutely need to reckon with and have an approach. And this could be journaling and meditation and breath work or exercise or, venting to a friend or, like there are a ton of strategies for dealing with criticism. And then once the waters, kind of level out, you can make choices about what you're willing or not willing to deal with, whether you're going to talk to the person or not talk to the person. And again, that's very specific to a lot of situations. And you may just find ways to enforce the boundary of, I don't take feedback from people who are triggered with me. You need to have the emotional waters leveled. I'm not interested in unsolicited advice. I have people that I go to for advice and recommendations. And if I want advice, I will ask for it. You'll be the first to know if I really want some counsel for you around an area where I feel like you're being successful. And for those people who, like the people who are a lot of times having the life results that I would most not like to have, and in many cases have worked very, very, very hard to shift for myself, are often the people who are most convinced that they are doing a good thing by giving unsolicited feedback. And so again, this notion where we should take in all feedback's constructive. I want to know how I'm viewed by people. It's okay if that's your philosophy. I mean, there's certainly people who are like, yes, I want to know how every person, is reflected. The one person I'm thinking of who kind of put it out to the world, like, does anyone have trigger with me? Does anyone have a problem with me? Or you can get in touch. I'm inviting processing conversations with absolutely anyone. That wouldn't have been someone I would have gone to counsel based on the kind of a lot of chaos and difficulty and complexity and emotionality and, things that were following his results. But, I totally honor him doing him. And that felt really authentic, and so I think there is value in knowing how we're impacting other people and knowing how we're received. But it's such a distorted mirror because people are coming with so much baggage and so many triggers and so much reactivity. And when something gets activated, they lose the ability to use their executive brain. I recently had an interaction where the bottom line was I held a boundary for the manyth time. It has happened a number of times, of someone who really, really valued my work, in a lot of financial struggle, wanted to find something that I would agree to that would allow her to have the work that she wanted without paying me my rates. I kindly said no. And then she got triggered, as she had a number of times. And then I tried to work with her, which, I admit was, if I'd been more present, this was somebody kind of on the periphery, I probably wouldn't have made that choice. I would have just let her sit with the trigger. But I genuinely liked her. There was a lot of spaced out history over time. And so, I reached out and said, look, you are special to me. It feels like you're trying to leverage the specialness to have special deals made. I just don't have the overhead. Even telling you no, put something into my inbox that I need to reckon with in some way. I just ask that you stop doing that. I care about you. You're special. I wish you well. And I just don't modify what I'm offering. I've put a lot of thought into it, and there's just too much bandwidth to customize unless somebody's paying me very well for it. So there are people who, are willing to pay extra and say, I want something that's not off the shelf and I'm willing to pay you for it. And that's a different equation. But for somebody who wants me to get involved in a negotiation to then pay me dramatically less or get something for free, not so great. And she called me a narcissist, and I think there were some other really mean things. I don't remember. There were a number of weaponized words, and how dare I, and all of that kind of thing. And what distills down for me was wounded little girl who just hated hearing no, who was trying to get seen and feel special by people collapsing boundaries and giving extra, and her having things that they wouldn't offer to other people, that there was something that was feeding her, in addition to just straight up like, I want the work, but I have the story or the experience that I can't pay for it, so I don't want to give it up, I don't want to step away and work with this. So a lot of things in play, but I think that once the first I'm so sorry, if you want one-on-one support, you're going to need to book a session. And then she tried to book it a different way, and I just refunded her money and said, sorry, I'm not available for this. I'm so sorry, I don't have an offer at the price point that would work for you. That's just not something I can offer. And then off to the races with an enormous amount of trigger. And I genuinely have compassion. Like I've so been in that place of hearing something really different, but I also really worked hard on my personal healing a very long time ago to have more success in relating to people. And I get that nobody likes to hear no, but if you have somebody who just makes it so expensive to enforce a boundary, it's kind of a strategy where we accidentally train people badly, where if you tell them no, the emotional drama around that is going to be so huge that you end up collapsing your boundaries, because you just don't want to deal with the emotional labor of someone in your life who's going to be super irrationally triggered with you and so mad and so reactive. And the challenge with that is that takes the relationship out of sustainability, because eventually for most people you get so annoyed that you're just over it and you don't care if the relationship blows up. And then there's intense boundarying, and then that person often takes their toys and goes home with the story of the profound evilness and awfulness of who you are. I find the irony is that the people that I've been the most generous with and kind of overgiven a little bit to, be out of compassion or whatever, and it doesn't always go this way, but I think the people who are the most not in the Katie fan club are people who I went out of my way to be extra generous to when we didn't have an energy exchange, and then stopped. And those are probably, if we took a survey, I think most people are, kind of neutral about me. I have people who are really in my fan club, and I have people who, undoubtedly think I'm a terrible person, and they've unfriended me on Facebook and, and the whole 9 yards. And I think those people often are the ones that I overgave to in some way. So it's kind of an ironic thing. I don't believe no good deed goes unpunished. But the nice thing is I make that choice very consciously, and then I don't end up nursing resentment of like, how could you, hate me after all that I've done for you? I don't get sucked into those. I'm like, yep, I know how this goes. I made a choice. This is a predictable outcome under the circumstances. Ah, well. And at the same time, I just don't tend to lose a lot of sleep over the not in Katie fan club, because it is really powerful to just focus on the relationships where I do have success. I think that's, for all the instincts like freaking out and feeling like we need to clean things up. And you do, if you're an agricultural farmer and you're having a blood feud about, cows breaking into the barley and, ruining the crop, and everybody is so bitter, like, living next to neighbors with bitterness when these are people you need to collaborate with is so vulnerable, so psychologically damaging and hard and tough. It feels really unsafe when there's a feud with neighbors. And likewise, in a hunter-gatherer tribe where you're just locked in with these people, it is a genuine survival threat. It will make your life harder if you can't have a reasonable accord with everyone in the tribe. These are big problems. So we come by it honestly, that the feeling of someone being mad at us and not liking us, especially those of us in a female body, the female suite of instincts is really emphasizing. I think testosterone in larger levels is a little bit more of a buffer to that, of like, well, this is my limit, and they don't think on it. They're like, I'll deal if it's a problem. But with that kind of response, we come by it honestly, but that's where the instincts really benefit from adult supervision. So when our instincts are screaming, you should solve the problem of the emotionally unregulated person who's projecting a lot of old mommy stuff onto you and howling about what an awful person you are, I feel like there's no good in engaging there. You just want a boundary and do whatever you need to do so that their capacity to disrupt what you're up to in life is minimized or eliminated. I think that's the most elegant solution. And, sometimes that's bigger than others, but looking at it from that perspective and recognizing the visceral impulse to try to reckon with the problem or ruminate on the problem of an irrational, triggered person who doesn't see you, who's responding out of some story they've made up in your head. We come by that honestly. And in the modern world where, if our neighbors are jerks, we can move. It's not super convenient. It's not really great, but if there's warfare, you might choose to be somewhere else. And I know not everybody in the world has that privilege, but I think a lot more people tell themselves the story that they don't than for whom it's, really, really factually true. So hopefully there's something useful for you here. And I hope that it helps you to, just know to kind of, file unsolicited, unqualified criticism in the round filing bin, as they say, which of course refers to the trash can. You're like, not necessary. And then, calm and soothe the instincts that still want to reckon with it. But I truly believe that triggered feedback is very, very seldom useful. I mean, for sure, if you have somebody you care about a lot and they don't cough up the truth, and then suddenly they're howling and screaming, you might be like, wow, this is some important communication that they haven't been able to cough up. But if there isn't like a power imbalance, like, your child or teenager who's coughing up the truth, that's a little bit different than a peer or an equal friend. And so these things are complicated, but I do feel like if somebody isn't someone you would go to for advice in the area, you really don't necessarily have to accept, allow, or engage with their unsolicited criticism or feedback. And because our brain has such a propensity to get spun about it, you may want to set some real functional boundaries in place, like walking away or hanging up the phone when it starts, or blocking them on email or unfriending them on Facebook, and taking whatever steps are needed to not have that input come in. Because for a lot of us, it just takes a minute to clean that out, and not having the overhead of doing it by not having unqualified people interacting with us can save a lot of grief. Thank you so much for joining me. To learn more about me and my work, please visit my website at handsoverheart.com. There you can join my mailing list for access to free bonus content in the members-only area. If you've enjoyed this, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. It would help me out a lot. Also, a special thank you to my patrons for your support. You offer me the time freedom to work on passion projects like this one. If you'd like to receive personal shamanic support from me and my team of guides, please consider joining my Patreon community. You'll find the link below. And again, thank you so much for listening. This is Katie Weatherup, wishing you wholeness and happiness.